Hey guys, for the second video for chapter 22, we'll be talking about crisis. Now, with this chapter on cross-cultural transactions and interactions, we focus an awful lot on the positive impacts of it, such as trade, right? Trade can be positive in resulting in cultural diffusion and the spreading of new technologies and crops, and it can be positive with the spread of trade, which can lead to increased wealth, but it can have some negative consequences as well, most notably the spread of disease. Plague epidemics killed millions in both Asia and Europe. It really wasn't until the 15th century that both China and Europe started to see recovery, which we'll talk about in the next video. And this, the plague that we're going to be discussing in this one is the bubonic plague. Now, the bubonic plague gets its name from the Hey guys, for the second video on chapter 22, we're going to be talking about crisis. Now, with cross-cultural transactions, a lot of times we focus on the positive aspects of it. The positive aspects from things such as trade. Trade can bring about the spread of technology. It can bring about the spread of ideas. It can result in cultural diffusion. It can also result in the spreading of wealth and the increasing of wealth in certain areas. But it can also have some negative consequences, most notably the spread of disease. Plague epidemics killed millions in both Asia and Europe. It really wasn't until the 15th century that both China and Europe started to see recovery. By far, the most notorious of these plagues was the bubonic plague. Now, the biggest thing to know about this plague was that it was a very effective killer. The bubonic plague gets its name from the internal hemorrhaging it causes. Right? It is a bacterial plague. You see a computer rendition of the bacteria. But the kind of hemorrhaging that it causes were known as buboes. All right, here's a modern day picture of it. The bubonic plague is not extinct. It still pops up from time to time. It's just that modern medicine and kind of our knowledge and understanding of it keeps it under control. Back when it broke out in the 12th century, we didn't have any of that. And so what resulted was just widespread and very, very fast-moving death. You see this kind of artistic rendition from England from that time period where you see kind of the sores that would develop all over the body. It would get really, really nasty. It would turn kind of this purple blackish color as well is another reason why it would eventually be called the Black Death. It was a pretty horrible disease. It killed around 70% of humans it infected, so at a very, very high death rate. And as I said, it was pretty horrible, painful. The effectiveness and gruesomeness of the disease led to an increase in fear and panic. One other thing about this picture you see up here, this guy, you see how, he's kind of almost looks like he's chanting and he's burning things. That was a common way to treat the plague at that time. Again, they didn't really have a strong understanding of the science behind it. They barely had any understanding of the science behind it. So the best they could do was have priests pray over you, or they would, burn certain herbs that they thought would kind of ward off almost evil spirits that were inhabiting you. It was very, very primitive. Okay, now this began in southwest China, and it spread initially with the Mongol conquest. The bacteria itself was carried by fleas. Okay, they were carried by these little bugs. And the fleas were then transported by rodents, especially rats. So the infected rodents, these rat fleas, when the rodents would die, the fleas would then look for the next available host. And when you're traveling on trade routes or on trade ships, that was humans. So the Mongol Empire, which went all the way from the Pacific through Eastern Europe and the Middle East, and remember, the Mongols protected trade, so these trade routes were regularly used. Unfortunately, this was a perfect facilitation for the rodents and the fleas to go with them. So by 1346, they had made it into this area, the Black Sea ports. And from there, it wasn't spread by conquest anymore. It was spread with trade. Italian merchants were the first to bring the infected rats to the Mediterranean ports from the Black Sea ports. And from there, it spread along the trade routes. Okay, so you look at the color codes here. 1347, the original ones, it's coming into the Black Sea, Constantinople, right? And then Sicily and so forth. And then first the Mediterranean regions. First Italy and then Greece, Even within that, the first year, it spread very, very quickly inland as well through Spain and France. Within 2 years, 1349, the kind of lighter tan areas, all of Central and most of Eastern Europe, up through England, even most of Ireland as well. It spread very, very quickly, both maritime and overland trade routes. The only regions were left relatively unaffected was if you went really far north into Scandinavia. It was a little too cold. The rats and the fleas couldn't survive quite as well. India as well remained almost completely untouched by the plague. India's population actually increased during this time. And sub-Saharan Africa. They just didn't have the regular trade across the Sahara Desert that it really made it that much of a threat. But Europe, big time hit by all of this. Now, the effects of the plague. First and foremost, you had population loss. Now, statistics vary since record keeping wasn't the most reliable, but it killed tens of millions in China and Europe. Europe itself lost roughly 1/3 of its population, and it took roughly a century for both areas to recover from the population losses. Economic effects. You see kind of how it was reflected in the artistry of the day. You've got all the dead bodies in this one coffin with the specter of death, the Grim Reaper, kind of riding above it. There are no living humans in this entire picture. But with the economic effects, the loss of life had a tremendous impact on all economic areas. Production decreased due to labor shortages. People were dying. They couldn't be working in the fields. They couldn't be manufacturing goods. And because of this decrease in production and the availability of workers, a lot of farm owners, larger farm owners and business owners and things like that, they put restrictions on workers. These were meant to prevent workers from moving to areas that either weren't afflicted or offered better pay. This was a regression essentially back to serfdom. It made the peasants tied to the land, which by the 1300s, a lot of places in Western Europe in particular were moving out of. Well, as you can imagine, the peasants didn't respond too well to this, and this in turn led to peasant rebellions. Now, the social effects really centered around fear. You look at the painting here with what's kind of the most prominent figure in it, but you've got the Grim Reaper, you've got death. Death was coming for everyone. No one was safe. You look at the picture here where, the fear was that the dead were getting so numerous that they would eventually start rising from the grave and walking, kind of like early zombie stories, basically. This killed everyone. It killed the young, it killed the old, it killed the rich, it killed the poor. Powerful bishops died, the same as commoners. People really, their faith in the church was very shook by this because they didn't feel that they could be protected. Entire towns and villages were wiped out. So it led to widespread panic. It also led to increased anti-Semitism, as Jews, unfortunately, were often blamed for it as the scapegoats. So major impact that it had on European society, the European economy, and European governments, as well as impacts it had on trans-regional trade along the Silk Roads. It kind of shut down for a while because of this, and it would have a major impact on the end of the Yuan dynasty in China. All right, so quick video about that, and in the next one, we will talk about the recovery in China and Europe.